And they're struggling in their league, yet they come up against Real Madrid and put in a performance of the season.
May 2025. 2 years ago, Real Madrid stood at the summit of European football. Champions League winners, La Liga champions. And then...
He's not thinking about that, he's thinking about another! And he's got another!
Dreadful embarrassment.
But they're a shambles at the moment. They are an absolute shambles.
Kylian Mbappé, finally, after a decade of courtship, finally in a white shirt. The project looked bulletproof. The question everyone was asking wasn't whether Real Madrid would dominate the next era of football. It was by how much. This week, Fede Valverde was taken to hospital after being punched by a teammate on the training ground. Real Madrid issued an official statement. Florentino Pérez got on the phone with his players. And the club heads into El Clásico this Sunday with nothing left to play for, while Barcelona prepare to be crowned champions on their pitch. How did they get here? And more importantly, is there any way back? To understand how a club collapses, you have to understand what it looked like at its peak. In the summer of 2024, Real Madrid were in a position that most clubs could only dream of. Back-to-back Champions League titles. A squad that had rediscovered the relentless, resilient identity that had made them the most decorated club in the history of the sport. And then came the signing that was supposed to cement everything. Kylian Mbappé, free transfer, technically, though the wages made that word somewhat generous, arrived at the Bernabeu to link up with Vinicius Júnior and Jude Bellingham. Three of the best players in the world, in their prime, at the same club. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new Galactico era. The third iteration of Real Madrid's recurring experiment in collecting elite individual talent and daring a manager to make it work. What nobody wanted to say out loud, and what is now impossible to ignore, is that the warning signs were baked into the premise from the very beginning. The core footballing issue at Real Madrid this season is, at its heart, not complicated. Mbappe and Vinicius Júnior are fundamentally the same type of player. Both are wide attackers who thrive on space, on running in behind, on taking defenders 1 versus 1 and exploiting the gaps that open up on the flanks. Neither is a natural center forward. Neither is built to operate in the cramped, static geometry that the number 9 role demands. When Mbappe plays as a false 9, which has been the most frequent solution this season, you end up with a situation where the center of the pitch is occupied by a player who wants to drift wide and create. Meanwhile, Vinicius is doing exactly the same thing on the left, and with Rodrigo operating on the right, you have 3 players whose natural instinct is to drive at defenders in wide areas, all competing for the same zones of the pitch, all making each other smaller versions of themselves. The numbers are damning. In the final stretch of the season, Real Madrid won just one of their last 6 league games with Mbappe in the starting lineup. In the 6 matches without him, they won all 6. The reverse is also true. In the games last season when Vinicius missed through injury or suspension, Mbappe scored 10 goals in 10 appearances. Together, they average. Apart, they excel. That is not, on its own, a crisis. Plenty of elite clubs carry tactical imbalances and find ways to manage them. The problem at Real Madrid is that nobody has been given the authority, or the time, to solve it. Carlo Ancelotti left in the summer of 2024. Whatever his shortcomings in the final months, Ancelotti had one quality that is almost impossible to quantify and almost impossible to replace. He could manage egos, not by confronting them, not by imposing a tactical system that forced players to change who they were, but by making every player in that dressing room feel like the most important person in the building. It is an extraordinarily rare skill, and the moment he walked out the door, Real Madrid discovered exactly how much they had been relying on it. Xabi Alonso was brought in to replace him. A coach with real tactical conviction, a clear identity, and the credibility that comes from having just delivered a historic unbeaten Bundesliga season with Bayer Leverkusen. The expectation was that he would impose structure, that he would demand more from this group of players, that under his guidance, the Mbappe-Vinicius imbalance would finally be addressed. It did not go that way. Reports began emerging of friction between Alonso and senior players. Vinicius, a player whose emotional intensity is one of his greatest assets and one of his most combustible liabilities, was seen reacting visibly to substitutions, to tactical decisions, to the kind of managerial authority that, at other clubs, would simply be part of the job. By the time Alonso was relieved of his duties mid-season, the narrative had already been written. The players had won. The manager had lost. Álvaro Arbeloa stepped in as caretaker. a former teammate of many of the club's legends, a man with no illusions about the size of the task in front of him. And in a moment that felt more like symbolism than coaching, he offered this comment to the press. "It hurts me when we see that all the other teams run more than us. We didn't build Real Madrid with players who take the field dressed in tuxedos, but with players who end up with the shirt covered in mud, sweat, and effort." Nobody needed to ask who that was aimed at. If the tactical problems and the managerial instability were the slow burn, what happened in the first week of May 2025 was the explosion. It started with Mbappé. Injured and unable to feature in upcoming fixtures, he was photographed, along with his girlfriend, Spanish actress Esther Exposito, on a private jet to Sardinia. The images spread across Spanish media within hours. A petition demanding his departure from the club began circulating online. Within days, it had collected millions of signatures. His representatives issued a statement clarifying that the trip had been approved by the club's medical staff, that the player was following his rehabilitation program, and that the reaction was disproportionate. He returned to Valdebebas almost immediately, training alone, visibly aware of the damage done. But the Sardinia story was almost a distraction, because at the training ground, something more serious was already developing. On Wednesday, during a training session at Valdebebas, Fede Valverde and Tchouameni were involved in a physical confrontation. These things happen in football. High-intensity environments, competitive players, the pressure of a failing season, tempers break. Normally, the expectation is resolution. The players shake hands, speak privately, move on. Management steps in if necessary. The story does not become a story. This time, it became a story. When the squad returned to Valdebebas on Thursday, the situation had not been resolved. According to reporting from Marca, confirmed subsequently by Fabrizio Romano and The Athletic's David Ornstein, two of the most reliable journalists covering European football, there was a second confrontation, more serious than the first. It ended with Valverde sustaining a head injury, severe enough to require hospital treatment. Real Madrid confirmed the incident in an official club statement. Florentino Pérez, by multiple accounts, was on the phone to both players directly. It was not, it emerged, even the first physical incident of the season. Back in February, a confrontation between Antonio Rudiger and Álvaro Carreras had already been reported by The Athletic. Sources indicated that tensions between the two had continued in the months since. Real Madrid were not dealing with a single flashpoint. They were dealing with a pattern. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath all of these incidents. The fights, the petitions, the Sardinia photographs, the substitution reactions, the managerial exits, these are not the disease. They are symptoms. The disease is a culture that has been years in the making. Real Madrid's model, under Florentino Pérez, has always rested on a fundamental assumption that the quality of the players is so high that the system will organize itself around them, that the brand, the history, the badge, the weight of expectation will provide enough cohesive force to hold a dressing room of elite egos together. For a long time, it worked. The first Galactico era produced trophies. The second, under Mourinho and then the regeneration years, eventually produced unprecedented Champions League success. The assumption felt validated. But the model has a ceiling. It works when the players are operating at a level where their results justify the latitude they are given. It breaks down when the results stop coming and the latitude remains. Because once a club's culture has established that players hold power over managers, that ego is accommodated rather than challenged, that the brand will absorb individual dysfunction as long as the goals keep going in. That culture does not reset when the goals stop coming. It calcifies. It becomes the environment in which younger players form their professional identity. And eventually, it becomes the only culture the club knows. Real Madrid are now 2 seasons without a major trophy. Barcelona are 11 points clear in La Liga and need a single point from Sunday's Clásico to be crowned champions at the Bernabeu. PSG, the club Mbappé left, have won the Champions League in the period since his departure. The optics are not incidental. They are a verdict. The question of who manages Real Madrid next season is, in one sense, the most obvious question to ask. Jose Mourinho's name has circulated with enough frequency and enough credibility from well-sourced reporters to take seriously. Mourinho at Benfica, where reports suggest a break clause in his contract becomes active the moment the Portuguese season ends, has been framed as the man capable of reimposing authority on a dressing room that has forgotten what authority looks like. Whether that framing holds up to scrutiny is a different matter. Mourinho's record in his latter years as a manager is well documented. And the specific dynamics of this Real Madrid squad, the player power, the ego distribution, the absence of the kind of shared identity that bonds dressing rooms through adversity, present challenges that go beyond any individual manager's capacity to resolve. The last time Mourinho was at Real Madrid, he fell out with Casillas, with Ramos, with Pepe, with Cristiano Ronaldo. That squad was more collectively accomplished than this one. It still ended badly. The deeper question, the one that follows Real Madrid into whatever comes next, is about the squad itself. The Mbappe-Vinícius coexistence has been tested for a full season and found wanting. One of them, almost certainly, will not be at the club by the time August arrives. Tchouameni's future, given the events of this week, must be in serious doubt. Rudiger, who has been at the center of multiple incidents this season, may follow. Bellingham, who has largely stayed above the noise, is perhaps the one player who offers a genuine foundation for whatever the next version of this club looks like. But player movements alone will not fix what is broken at Real Madrid. The culture that produced 2 physical altercations in a single season, that saw 3 managers lose authority in the span of 12 months, that allowed a dressing room to become a series of competing factions rather than a collective unit. That culture requires more than a transfer window to dismantle. It requires a fundamental reassessment of how the club operates from the very top. Whether Florentino Pérez is capable of conducting that reassessment, or whether he will reach, as he has before, for the most spectacular available solution and hope the names paper over the cracks, is perhaps the most important question in European football right now. 2 years ago, Real Madrid were champions of Europe. This Sunday, they play their biggest rivals in a game that means nothing, in a season that has produced nothing, while a teammate recovers from a head injury sustained at the hands of another teammate at their own training ground. The dressing room didn't just explode this week. It had been filling with gas for a long time. This week, someone finally lit the match. If you want to understand how Manchester United's dressing room fell into a similar spiral of dysfunction, and how one manager tried to hold it together, that video is linked in the description. Thanks for watching.